A billionaire walks into his mansion 3 days early expecting silence. But instead of peace, he hears the sound of children. What he finds in his kitchen shatters his rules, shakes his heart, and changes everything he thought he knew. Trust broken, promises tested, and a single decision that might cost him more than all his fortune. Watch till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. And if it moves you even a little, make sure to hit subscribe right now. You don't want to miss the stories that could change how you see the world. The front door clicked with a sharp sound that carried across the silence of the mansion, announcing his return before his presence could. Daniel Hartley, known in business circles as the man who struck fear into competitors and awe into investors, stepped back into his kingdom 3 days earlier than anyone expected. His navy suit was still crisp from the jet, his tie adjusted with mechanical precision, and his posture straight as if he never carried the weight of exhaustion. He had cut his overseas trip short, weary of boardroom games and sycophantic smiles, yearning only for that rarest of luxuries in his world: silence. But silence was not what he found. Instead, faint noises reached his ears. Not the crisp mechanical hum of his security systems, not the elegant tick of the antique clock in the hall, and not the soft hush of silence he craved. These were softer, more chaotic noises. Gentle babbling, a small giggle, then a muffled cry. He paused, every sense suddenly sharpened, confusion flickering across his otherwise unshakable features. Children. The sound was unmistakable. His mansion, a fortress of order and discipline, was not meant to echo with childish noises. He paid staff to keep it running like a flawless machine, and children were never part of that equation. His shoes struck against marble floors as he strode down the hallway, irritation hardening with every step. Who had dared disrupt his sanctuary in his absence? His jaw tightened as his anger rose. He had little tolerance for anything messy, improvised, or out of place. The sight that awaited him as he entered the kitchen stopped him in his tracks. There, standing by the spotless granite counter, was Elena, his maid, still dressed in her pale blue uniform and rubber gloves, methodically wiping down the surface. But strapped to her chest in a gray sling, like fragile treasures hidden against danger, were 2 pale-haired toddlers. Their small hands clutched at the fabric, their wide eyes blinking up at him with innocent confusion. Daniel froze for the fraction of a second, disbelief warring with outrage, before his voice tore through the kitchen like thunder. What the hell is this? The polished control he commanded in business meetings shattered in an instant. His orderly mansion had become the last thing he could tolerate, a sanctuary invaded, a rule broken, a problem staring him in the face in the form of 2 tiny strangers. And as his fury rose, Elena's weary eyes met his unflinching, waiting for the storm she knew had finally come. Daniel's voice sliced through the air, each word sharp enough to make one of the babies whimper and squirm in its sling. Elena's hands, still gloved, stilled on the counter, but she did not flinch away. Slowly she turned, her dark eyes locking with his, wide with exhaustion, yet braced with something firmer than fear. "Sir," she whispered, her accent soft but her resolve solid. "You weren't supposed to be back yet." That was her first defense, not an explanation. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and his voice rose, rolling like thunder over polished marble floors. "That's all you have to say? You weren't expecting me. You turned my house into a daycare and you think it matters when I chose to return." The babies shifted, pressing tighter against Elena's chest as she instinctively rocked them, murmuring words in Spanish meant to soothe. Daniel's fury, however, was not so easily quieted. "Who are they? Why in God's name are they here?" His eyes darted from the pristine counters to the toddlers, as though their very presence defiled the perfection he had built in this house. She did not drop her gaze, did not allow herself to cower. "They are my sister's children," she answered softly but firmly, her voice a mixture of weariness and desperation. Daniel blinked, his expression faltering for only the smallest fraction of a moment before twisting into a bitter scoff. "So what, they're yours now? You think because you scrub my floors you can smuggle in whoever you please?" His tone was venom dressed as irony, and it echoed in the silence between them. Elena adjusted the sling over her body, pressing her palm gently against the curve of a child's back, as though shielding them from his words. "Their mother is dead," she said, and the way those 3 words landed was heavier than the drop of any gavel. Daniel's chest stilled, his brows knitting harshly, but he said nothing. The silence gave her strength, and in that stillness she continued. "Their father disappeared after the funeral. They have no one but me, my mother, and this promise I made. My old mother has tried, God bless her, but she can no longer carry both. She fell last week. Her body is failing her, and I had no choice but to bring them here with me." Tears welled at the corners of her eyes, but her posture did not bend. "I could not abandon them." Daniel's lips curled, a sharp, humorless smirk of bourgeois cruelty. "Not my problem, Elena. You were hired to work, not to haul children into my home like baggage. Do you understand what this looks like to me? To my reputation?" Her eyes flashed in anger at his words, though her voice came with restraint. "You worry about reputation. I worry about survival. That is the difference between us, sir." Daniel slammed his hand against the counter, the crack startling the children into whimpers. He leaned forward, looming like a storm, his hot voice lowered to a razor's edge. "Don't you dare twist this onto me! You deceived me. You broke my trust." Elena clutched the sling protectively, her chin lifting with quiet defiance. "Yes, I broke your trust, but I have not broken my promise to my sister. Fire me if you will, but I will not let them go." And with those words, she turned what should have been a maid's apology into a declaration of war, one that Daniel could not so easily dismiss. Daniel stared at her, his chest heaving, unable to believe the audacity of what he'd just heard. This was his home, his carefully constructed fortress of quiet efficiency, and yet this woman, this maid of all people, was standing her ground against him as though she were his equal. His rage boiled over, the kind he usually reserved for incompetent CEOs or weak-willed investors who wasted his time. But here it was, bubbling in his own kitchen, directed not at a rival titan of industry, but at a maid with 2 children strapped to her chest. He wanted to unleash it all, to end the conversation by firing her on the spot, to have his lawyers draft the paperwork before the hour passed. And yet, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, the weight of her words clung to him like heavy chains. "Not my problem," he repeated, almost as if saying the phrase would absolve him of the gnawing discomfort growing inside his chest. Elena took a shaky breath. The babies stirred restlessly at his tone, their small fingers clenching and unclenching against the fabric of the sling. Still, her eyes didn't leave his. They were ringed with shadows of sleepless nights, but behind them was something fierce. The fire of someone fighting battles no one else wanted to fight. "You think everything ends with money and contracts," she said, her voice taut but steady. "But some things have no price. A promise given to family is one of those. When my sister lay dying, she put her hand in mine and told me, 'Elena, keep them safe. Don't let them be lost.' Do you understand that? She didn't speak of money. She spoke of blood, love, duty. Things your reputation cannot buy, and your fortune cannot erase." Daniel's jaw tensed, the muscles ticking as if her words were chiseling at a stone wall he had built over years. Pride urged him to dismiss her outright, to show her the door and reassert control. But something in the image before him made that impossible. 2 children, innocent and quiet now, sheltered by the only person left who cared enough not to abandon them. Elena's trembling hands pressed them close, her back straight, her chest heaving but unyielding. For every inch of ground he pressed forward with his wealth and anger, she stood firmer on the worn foundation of loyalty and survival. "Rules exist for a reason," Daniel snapped, more defensive now than commanding. "Without rules there is chaos, betrayal, weakness. I built everything I own by demanding order." Elena's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something bitter, weary. "Then maybe it's time you learn that life is not built in boardrooms. Life is built here, in moments where the rules can't save you and only compassion stands between one path and another. You have never had to choose between your career and the children of your own blood. I have. And I chose them." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken truths stretching between 2 worlds colliding under the same roof. Daniel leaned his palms on the counter, staring at her as if trying to decipher whether her resolve was madness or courage. All he knew for certain was that she wasn't backing down, and that, somehow, unsettled him more than her betrayal itself. Daniel's silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. He pressed both palms flat onto the counter, the polished marble cool beneath his heated skin, breathing through clenched teeth. Never in his life had anyone challenged him like this inside his own house. Business rivals might fight him, politicians might resist him, but in the end, they bent or broke under the sheer force of his will. Yet here was a maid, a woman barely earning enough to keep her roof sturdy, staring him down without blinking while holding two fragile lives close to her chest. Rage and disbelief wrestled within him, but underneath that, buried deep where he refused to look, something softer stirred, something he hadn't felt for years. He exhaled sharply, determined to smother it. "You think strength is defiance?" he asked, lowering his voice sharp as a blade. "You think carrying babies into my house without permission is courage?" "No, it's recklessness. It's self-destruction." Elena adjusted the sling. The babies pressed tighter into her as if sensing the tremor in his tone. Her voice cracked once but steadied quickly. "Strength is choosing family over fear. Reckless or not, at least I will never tell them I walked away. At least when they're older, I won't have to look into their eyes and explain that I abandoned them because it was easier." Her words carved through the air, carving into him before he allowed himself to realize it. He wanted to sneer, to mock her, to reduce her defiance to foolishness, yet something in the raw conviction of her tone forced him to meet her eyes again. They were tired eyes, etched with grief, and long nights spent rocking children who weren't her own, but they burned with unyielding resolve. And in their fire he caught the faintest reflection of his own emptiness. For all his wealth, his mansion, his empire, what human bond had he fought for with that kind of ferocity? Daniel's lips thinned. "You broke this house's order," he said finally, "and there are consequences for that. Do not mistake this moment of restraint for mercy. What you've done cannot simply vanish." Elena nodded slowly, clutching the infants close. "I know, but sometimes survival means breaking rules, sir. Sometimes protecting the innocent means carrying chaos into order. You've lived your life in control. I've lived mine in struggle. To survive, we do what must be done." The baby on her left let out a soft whimper, breaking the tension. Elena instinctively rocked them, murmuring again in Spanish, the tender cadence filling the air where Daniel's fury had only moments earlier resounded. That contrast gnawed at him. The echo of his reputation, his obsession with control, suddenly sounded hollow against the gentle lull of a woman holding on to promises greater than herself. Daniel straightened, his face carved into stone once more. But for the first time since setting foot in the kitchen, there was a crack in his armor. He tightened his tie as though reasserting his grip on power, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, something dangerously close to uncertainty. Daniel turned away for a moment, pacing across the gleaming tiles of his kitchen as though walking might help him reclaim control. His footsteps echoed like a metronome to his own turbulent thoughts. Every fiber of him screamed to act decisively, to fire her, to escort her out with security, to remind her of her place and what defiance cost. That was the Daniel Hartley people knew and feared, the man who tolerated no weakness, no betrayal, no bending of his rules. And yet, as his gaze flickered back to Elena, still standing tall though her shoulders trembled under the weight of both his fury and the children pressing into her, that iron certainty began to falter. Her words replayed in his mind, each one a thorn pricking the carefully woven armor he had built around himself through years of ruthless ambition. He despised deceit, but he could not ignore the truth in her plea. Family mattered, even when broken, and promises sometimes outweighed contracts. His lips parted to deliver the verdict that would end this drama, but no words came. Instead, the silence stretched long enough for Elena to speak first. "You live in a world where power means control, sir," she said gently, her eyes glistening though her chin remained high. "In my world, power is not money or status. Power is surviving the impossible. Power is keeping children alive when life tries to rip them away. You judge me for crossing a line. But what would you do if the innocent lives in your arms were the last thing your sister begged of you? Daniel stiffened, the question striking harsher than any accusation. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then curled his fists at his sides. The truth was, he had never been forced to choose. No one had ever demanded of him something so raw, so human. His empire shielded him from such burdens, until now. The smaller of the two children suddenly reached out of the sling, a tiny hand stretching toward him with aimless curiosity. Daniel froze. The fingers, soft and impossibly delicate, wavered in the air as though reaching for something unseen. He stared, transfixed at that fragile movement. The innocence of it gnawed at his defenses more effectively than any argument had. For the first time in years, he felt a tug he couldn't name, an ache deep in his chest that unsettled him. He tore his gaze away, shaking his head as though trying to scatter the sensation. You lied, he muttered coldly, clinging to what authority he could salvage. You may call it survival, but you hid them in my house, and that is betrayal. Elena's reply came instantly, low but unwavering. I did not lie. I protected. I hid them because for 3 days there was nowhere else safe enough. 3 days, sir. That is all I stole from you. But in those 3 days I kept my promise. Can you swear that in my place you would have done differently? His mouth pressed into a hard line, his eyes narrowing not in anger now, but in conflict. Her words refused to leave him, weighing heavier than every fortune he had ever counted. Daniel moved to the window, his back to her now, shoulders squared yet somehow heavier than before, as though her words had laid chains upon him. Outside, the manicured garden stretched in flawless symmetry, every hedge trimmed to perfection, every path swept clean by workers who followed his orders without hesitation. It was a mirror of his life, precise, controlled, predictable. But behind him was chaos embodied, 2 restless children, a maid whose eyes dared him to pass judgment, and a promise stronger than his rules. He pressed his hand against the cool glass, fighting to gather the authority that seemed to slip away every passing second. You crossed a line, Elena, he finally said, his voice measured but quieter now. 3 days of broken trust is enough to uproot everything. This house runs on discipline, not emotion. Without rules, there is collapse. Elena's voice came steadier than he expected. And without compassion, there is nothing worth surviving for. He turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. Don't mistake me for a man you can preach to. She shook her head slightly. No, sir. I mistake you for a man who has never had to make the choice I made. That is not preaching. That is perspective. The words landed with precision, not shouted but carved, cutting into the iron plates of his pride. He opened his mouth to retort but stopped when one of the toddlers let out a soft cry. Elena instinctively shifted, bouncing lightly on her feet, whispering words of comfort in Spanish. The sound unfurled through the room delicately, a mother's song from a woman who wasn't their mother but carried their survival on her shoulders nonetheless. Daniel stared, suddenly struck by the absurd dichotomy before him, the warmth of lullabies colliding with the coldness of his marble floors. In that strange clash he felt something crack. He rubbed a hand over his jaw and spoke, low but firm, as though forcing control back into his tone. From this moment forward, they cannot remain here. This is non-negotiable. My house will not become a refuge. Elena's lips trembled, but she held her ground. Then fire me, she whispered back. But I will keep them close until my mother can recover. I will not hand them to strangers, and if that means I lose everything else, then so be it. Her defiance hit him harder than any raised voice could. For a maid, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who refused to break, even when survival cost everything. He leaned closer, lowering his tone into something dangerous. You think bravery makes rules vanish? Her eyes glistened as she answered quietly. No, but sometimes bravery is the only thing that makes rules worth breaking. For a long beat, the mansion held stillness, but it was no longer the silence of control. It was the silence of an empire shaken. The silence of a man realizing that a uniformed maid had just redrawn the lines inside his own house. Daniel stood in that silence, his breath heavier than it should have been, his thoughts becoming a battlefield of conflicting truths. On one side was the bedrock of his world: power, rules, image, control. On the other side was this woman with 2 children clinging to her heart, wielding not wealth but raw devotion. He despised the way her words lingered in his mind, hated that her defiance picked at old scars he thought he had buried long ago. The mansion, usually his fortress, suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as though the air itself weighed more. He paced again, every step hitting the floor as if he could stomp out the unwanted thoughts crowding him. "You speak as though breaking rules is noble," he muttered at last, almost to himself. "But rules are the only reason chaos doesn't consume us. They are why I have built everything I own." Elena followed him with her eyes, her body still, rigid to keep the children steady. "Then maybe your empire was built to protect you from people like me," she said quietly. "People who don't have the luxury of rules. We don't wake up with choices. We wake up with survival. You've built walls of marble, I've built walls with promises I made to the dying. Only one of us knows what it means to carry 2 lives and have nothing to offer them but your own hands." Her voice wavered near the end, but her eyes held their fire. Daniel stopped pacing. He turned to her, studying her with a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Yet what struck him more than her stubbornness was her exhaustion, the kind that went beyond lack of sleep. It was grief etched into her very bones. He knew the language of grief, though he never uttered it aloud. Years ago, he had buried it, trading softness for stone, exchanging vulnerability for assets and contracts. He never let anyone see the cost. And seeing it now in her, raw, unmasked, unrefined, stirred something unsteady in him. One of the children suddenly let out a sharp, plaintive cry that cut through the room. Instinct flickered inside Daniel to recoil from the sound, but instead he found himself pausing, uncomfortably aware of how fragile such a noise was. Elena hushed them softly, murmuring words he could not understand, but their tenderness lodged into the air like a thorn he couldn't shake. He pressed his lips together. "This cannot continue," he said again, though the bite in his voice had dulled. "Your mother is too weak, and you cannot keep dragging them here. There must be another solution." Elena nodded faintly, as if she had waited for those words. "Yes, there must be. But solutions cannot exist in shelters where children are swallowed by systems that never return them. I have to believe there is another way, sir. I have to, because without that belief I will fail them, and failure is the one thing I cannot allow." For once, Daniel had no immediate retort. Her conviction hung between them, turning his kitchen into a courtroom where she was both defendant and accuser. And for the first time he found himself without a verdict to deliver. Daniel leaned against the counter now, his usually rigid posture softening as though an invisible weight pulled on the edges of his frame. He tried to keep his expression unreadable, but even he could feel the shift. Everything about this confrontation felt different from the countless showdowns he'd had with powerful men in tailored suits. Those were battles waged in numbers and threats. This was something else entirely. He was up against a woman whose only weapons were her voice, her resolve, and the fragile children asleep against her chest. Yet somehow he found himself losing ground to her every word. He rubbed his forehead, searching his mind for a path that reasserted his dominance, but those paths all ended in cruelty, and cruelty was suddenly harder to justify than he wanted to admit. "You should have told me from the start," he said finally, his voice less like thunder now, more like gravel under strain. "Do you realize how different this would have been if you had come to me honestly?" Elena tilted her head slightly, her exhaustion painting her features but her strength still visible in her stance. "Do you realize why I didn't? Because honesty in your world often means punishment in mine. I was afraid, sir. Afraid that if I told you, you would see me as just another broken woman and toss me aside before I could even try." Her words pierced, sharper than any accusation. For a man who prided himself on commanding loyalty, it stung to know that loyalty to her family meant deception to him. He folded his arms as if to shield himself from the strange ache in his chest. "And yet here we are," he muttered. "Here we are," she echoed softly, her voice nearly breaking but catching itself on the edge of resolve. He turned his gaze to the children, whose tiny breaths rose and fell with unknowing rhythm. They were innocent variables in this equation, their lives hanging in the balance of choices made by an obstinate maid and an unwilling billionaire. Against his will, he felt his chest tighten. There was nothing strategic about this, nothing profitable to be gained. Yet walking away, forcing them out, felt unbearably hollow. It was the same hollowness he had lived with for years, but had managed to bury under layers of wealth and achievement. Now it resurfaced, unbidden and undeniable. He pushed away from the counter, straightening, trying again to carve his pride into the room. You made a mistake. A costly one, and I don't forgive mistakes lightly. Elena swallowed but lifted her chin. I don't need forgiveness. I only need space to keep a promise. Fire me if that helps your pride. Replace me if it restores your order. But understand this. I will not abandon them. The finality in her words struck him harder than he expected. Recognition stirred within him. The kind of recognition that came from seeing in another person a reflection you swore you would never reveal in yourself. And for the first time all evening, Daniel Hartley felt a fissure of something dangerously close to compassion creeping through the cracks of his iron will. Daniel's fists curled and uncurled at his sides. His mind tangled between pride and something far more unsettling. He had the power to end this conversation with one word, to discard her defiance as easily as he discarded bad investments. Yet his tongue refused to shape the command. Instead, he found his eyes wandering back to the children, to the tiny shapes tucked against her body, their faces pressed into the fabric with utter trust that she would keep them safe. That trust was unshakable, uncalculated, unconditional. Things Daniel had long forgotten belonged in the world. His voice, when it finally came, was measured and clipped, yet softer than it had been all evening. They don't step foot in this house again unless I say so, he warned, his words drawing invisible lines around his sanctuary. Elena nodded slowly, her lips trembling but her eyes locked onto him. She looked like a soldier who had lost countless battles and yet refused to surrender. I understand, she said. Her agreement, calm and unresentful, unsettled him even further. Normally obedience satisfied him, fed his ego, reminded him of his authority. But this was different. Her obedience came laced with sorrow, with dignity intact, and it carried more weight than any contract he had ever enforced. He cleared his throat. But your mother, he continued, pausing as if reluctant to acknowledge his next words. She needs help. Real help. Doctors, medication, someone to carry the weight she no longer can. I will see that it is arranged. Elena's eyes widened, startled by what sounded dangerously like compassion disguised as authority. She blinked rapidly, suspicious at first, then softened with disbelief. You would do that? He straightened, tugging his cuffs, as if the motion would restrain the drift of his emotions. Not for them, he replied coldly, almost rehearsed. For you. Because you've proven something I rarely see in anyone. I've dealt with men who would betray their own blood for money, yet you've carried 2 children on your chest while scrubbing floors, without falling apart. That kind of loyalty is useful. His words caught at the end, uncharacteristically human, but he masked it quickly. Elena clutched the children tighter, her knees visibly weakened by the sudden shift, but her chin raised nonetheless. Useful or not, she whispered, I will never stop choosing them. His gaze hardened, though there was a flicker of something unsteady in it, a glint that betrayed the collapse of a wall he had built over decades. He turned away so she wouldn't see. She had brought something into his home he could neither control nor banish, and protecting his fortress no longer felt as simple as shutting a door. The billionaire who thought compassion was weakness had, without anticipating it, offered help. And in that moment, he realized the most dangerous thing about her was not her defiance. It was that she was forcing him to remember he was still human. The kitchen felt different now, though nothing had physically changed. The marble floor still gleamed, the counters still shone, the air still carried the faint scent of disinfectant, but something invisible had shifted. Daniel stood tall, his face fixed in its usual mask of authority. Yet beneath that mask, His thoughts simmered in unfamiliar directions. He had not expected this night to pull him into a battle of conscience, nor did he understand why it was proving harder than any merger or hostile takeover he had ever led. Deals had winners and losers. This, however, had no such clarity. Elena remained motionless near the counter, the babies pressed closely against her, their small breaths warming her skin as if tethering her to courage she no longer thought she had left. Her body sagged from exhaustion, yet her presence radiated unbroken defiance. She had pleaded, fought, and finally accepted his verdict on the children not returning. Yet somehow she stood as if victorious because she had not abandoned them. Daniel's eyes landed on the newborn fingers slipping outside the sling again, curling in unconscious gestures that seemed to reach for the air itself. It tore into him with the quiet force of a memory, faint and nearly forgotten, of his own sister when they were young, before wealth hardened him, before ambition taught him to smother every flicker of tenderness. He inhaled sharply, forcing that recollection back into the shadows where he had buried it. Still, it lingered, the ache of something once untouched. "You'll stay," he said finally, his tone authoritative but carrying less ice. "But from this point you answer honestly. No more secrets, no more hiding. If you want to remain under this roof, you give me truth." Elena, overwhelmed by the unexpected words, blinked back tears she thought she had already run dry. Her voice trembled but did not break. "Truth I can give. Abandonment I cannot." He gave a curt nod, as though sealing an agreement the way he might conclude a deal, though this pact bore no numbers or signatures. "Your mother will be taken care of properly. I'll see that arrangements are made tomorrow. And as for the children, no shelters, no system that swallows them. That much I'll ensure." The words fell from his lips, not with calculation, but with a weight he didn't fully understand. Elena gasped, her free hand covering her mouth as relief flooded her features. Gratitude radiated from her, but she bowed her head instead of erupting in thanks, silently acknowledging the fragility of this moment. Daniel turned sharply, unwilling to let her see the crack in his armor expand. His steps echoed down the long hallway, fading into the sprawling emptiness of his house. Yet the emptiness no longer felt clean, no longer felt absolute. It felt heavier, suffused with something dangerously like responsibility. Back in the kitchen, Elena exhaled at last, her knees bending as she leaned against the counter, tears slipping silently as the weight of 3 ruthless days finally released. She pressed her lips to the children's heads, whispering into their soft hair, "For now, we are safe." In the grand halls of a billionaire's mansion, promises bound tighter than contracts had been made. And though Daniel Hartley would never admit it aloud, deep in the silence of his own thoughts he realized that for the first time in years, his wealth had led him not to power, but to humanity.